The U.S. Army in Vietnam was collapsing. Soldiers were killing their own officers in over 900 fragging incidents. The military was desperate to make an example of someone. Their choice? An outspoken black soldier who hated the war. There was just one problem. He was innocent. March 15th, 1971. Bien Hoa Air Base, Vietnam. A fragmentation grenade detonated inside the officers' barracks of an artillery unit, tearing through the darkness with lethal efficiency. When the smoke cleared, First Lieutenant Thomas Delwo lay dying, scheduled to leave Vietnam the very next morning. First Lieutenant Richard Harlan would never wake up. Within 90 minutes, the Army had its suspect. Private Billy Dean Smith, a 23-year-old black draftee from Watts, who had the audacity to speak his mind about racism and an unjust war. They would hold him in solitary confinement for nearly 2 years, demand his execution, and build their case on evidence so flimsy it would collapse in spectacular fashion. But what made Billy Dean Smith guilty in the eyes of his commanders wasn't evidence. It was the fact that he refused to be what they called a good soldier. Private Billy Dean Smith never wanted to go to Vietnam. Born in Bakersfield, California in 1948, he was one of 12 children in a family that moved from Texas to the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles when Billy was 9 years old. After graduating from Washington High School in 1967, he worked as a machinist, drove a school bus, and sold cars, picking up whatever jobs he could find. When his draft notice arrived in 1969, he knew exactly what the Vietnam War was and what it represented. He'd watched the Watts riots of 1965, seen the police brutality that sparked them, understood the connection between the violence inflicted on black Americans at home and the violence they were expected to inflict on Vietnamese people abroad. His family convinced him not to resist the draft. They knew what happened to black men who defied the system, especially in 1969, when draft resistance could mean years in federal prison and a destroyed future. So Billy reported for basic training, then advanced individual training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and in October 1970, he shipped out to Vietnam. He arrived with his eyes wide open, knowing the war was wrong, but respecting his family's wishes that he not throw his life away fighting the draft. That respect for his family's judgment would prove costly. Had he resisted induction, he might have faced 2 years in prison. Instead, by trying to survive within the system, he would spend nearly 2 years in solitary confinement for a crime he didn't commit. Vietnam was everything Billy had feared, and worse. The racism that pervaded American society didn't disappear in the jungles of Southeast Asia. It intensified. Black soldiers made up 23% of combat troops, despite being only 11% of the American population. They were disproportionately assigned to the most dangerous positions, disproportionately disciplined for minor infractions, disproportionately denied promotions. A 1972 Defense Department study would reveal that black troops received 34.3% of courts-martial and comprised 58% of prisoners at Long Binh Jail, the largest American military prison in Vietnam. The statistics told the story that every black soldier in Vietnam already knew the system was designed to break them. Billy refused to pretend otherwise. He talked openly about the racism he experienced daily. He questioned why black men were dying to suppress Vietnamese self-determination when black people couldn't exercise basic rights at home. He stated repeatedly that the war was unjust and racially motivated, that he hated the habitual butchery of the Vietnamese people. These weren't quiet grumblings shared only with close friends. Billy made his opposition known because he believed silence was complicity. This honesty made him a marked man. His commanding officer was Captain Randall Rigby, and Rigby's right hand was First Sergeant Billy Willis. Within months of arriving in Vietnam, Billy Dean Smith had received 3 Article 15 non-judicial punishments for what the Army called minor infractions. One punishment was for unsatisfactory shaving, an offense routinely overlooked in combat zones, where soldiers went days without access to proper facilities. The charges weren't about maintaining military standards. They were about putting an uppity black soldier in his place. According to Captain Rigby, Smith was unenthusiastic about closing with the enemy, military jargon for engaging in combat. An article in the Black Scholar would later put it more plainly. 6 months in Vietnam had gained Billy the reputation of having a bad attitude. Billy Dean was not a good soldier. By March 1971, the Army was processing Billy for discharge for unsuitability and unfitness. They wanted him gone, and he wanted to leave. The paperwork was moving forward. In a rational world, this would have been the end of Billy Dean Smith's military career. An early discharge, a young man sent home from a war he never believed in. His family's worst fears about the consequences of resistance avoided. But the early morning hours of March 15th, 1971 would change everything. The explosion that killed Lieutenants Delwo and Harlan was part of a phenomenon that would define the later years of the Vietnam War: fragging. The term came from fragmentation grenades, the weapon of choice for soldiers who decided their greatest threat wasn't the Viet Cong, but their own officers. Between 1969 and 1972, there were over 900 documented or suspected fragging incidents in Vietnam. The reasons varied: officers who ordered suicidal missions, racism, retaliation for excessive discipline, the chaotic breakdown of military order as the war dragged on and morale collapsed. By 1971, Colonel Robert Heinl declared that our army that now remains in Vietnam is in a state approaching collapse, with individual units avoiding or having refused combat, killing their officers, drug-ridden, and dispirited, where not near mutinous. When Captain Rigby arrived at the scene on March 15th, he immediately claimed that he and First Sergeant Willis had been the intended targets because they were to have slept in the barracks that night. Why they weren't in the barracks that night was never adequately explained, but it didn't matter. What mattered was finding someone to blame, and Captain Rigby knew exactly who that someone would be. As First Sergeant Willis would admit during the eventual trial, his reasoning was brutally simple. Smith was the only man I had problems with, and his was the first name that popped into my head. Think about that for a moment. 2 officers were dead, another wounded, and within minutes the commanding officer decided the guilty party, based not on evidence but on personal animosity toward a soldier who had criticized racism and questioned the war. The investigation that followed wasn't an investigation at all. It was a predetermined conclusion looking for evidence to support it. 90 minutes after the explosion, Captain Rigby called a battalion formation and arrested Billy Dean Smith in front of every potential witness, ensuring that anyone who might testify would know exactly who the Army had decided was guilty. They charged him with 2 counts of premeditated murder for the deaths of Lieutenants Delwo and Harlan, 2 counts of premeditated attempted murder of Captain Rigby and First Sergeant Willis, and assault. The Army was asking for the death penalty. Billy Dean Smith, who had never been convicted of a violent crime, who was being processed for discharge because the Army wanted him gone, was now facing execution for a fragging attack that occurred while his commanders were conveniently absent from the barracks they claimed were their intended sleeping quarters. The Army transported Billy back to the United States and locked him in the Fort Ord stockade in California. His cell measured 5 feet by 9 feet. He spent 23 hours out of every 24 in solitary confinement. No bail, no trial date initially set, just isolation, day after day, month after month, while the Army built its case against him. This treatment wasn't standard procedure for accused soldiers awaiting court-martial. It was punishment before conviction, confinement designed to break a man psychologically before the trial even began. The contrast with how the Army treated white officers accused of war crimes couldn't have been more stark. First Lieutenant William Calley had been convicted in March 1971, the same month as the Bien Hoa fragging, of murdering 22 Vietnamese civilians at My Lai, though the actual death toll exceeded 300. Calley admitted to ordering his men to shoot unarmed villagers into mass graves, to killing civilians personally, to war crimes that shocked even a nation numbed by years of Vietnam War atrocities. His conviction came with a life sentence. President Richard Nixon immediately intervened, ordering Calley released from prison and placed under house arrest in private officer quarters at Fort Benning. Calley lived in comfort, received full officer pay, enjoyed frequent visits from his girlfriend, and would ultimately serve just 3.5 years before being paroled. Billy Dean Smith, not yet convicted of anything, lived in a cell barely larger than a bathroom, isolated from human contact, while the army prepared to execute him. The difference in treatment was so glaring that anti-war activists and civil rights organizations used it as their primary rallying cry. Billy has spent 18 months in pre-trial solitary confinement on flimsy evidence, while convicted mass murderer Calley lives in luxury under Nixon's protection. The comparison wasn't subtle. Calley was white and had murdered Vietnamese civilians, actions that aligned with the war's objectives, even if they technically violated military law. Smith was black and stood accused of killing white officers, threatening the military hierarchy itself. The system's priorities were crystal clear. 16 months passed, then 18. Billy remained in solitary confinement, while his case became a cause célèbre for the anti-war movement. Vietnam Veterans Against the War, the United States Servicemen's Fund, and the Black Panther Party organized demonstrations and fundraisers. Angela Davis, recently freed from her own politically motivated imprisonment, advocated for Billy's case. Actor Burt Lancaster contributed money for his defense. Civil rights attorney Luke McKissick agreed to represent him pro bono. The Army's attempt to make an example of Billy Dean Smith was backfiring, turning him into a symbol of military injustice and racism. In September 1972, Billy's court-martial finally began at Fort Ord. The proceedings would last 2 months and generate national and international press coverage. This was the first time anyone in the United States had been tried for a fragging committed in Vietnam, and the Army was seeking the death penalty before the presiding judge removed capital punishment from consideration at the trial's start. The jury consisted of 7 career officers, 5 white, 2 black. Not a jury of peers for an enlisted draftee, but what Billy would get nonetheless. The prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence and assumptions. Captain Rigby and First Sergeant Willis testified that Smith was a disciplinary problem, and they believed he hated them enough to want to kill them. The defense countered with witnesses who testified that resentment against Rigby and Willis was widespread among the troops, that Billy wasn't unique in disliking his commanders. The defense also pointed out an obvious logical flaw. Why would Smith try to kill the very commanding officer who was processing his discharge and sending him home? As defense attorney Louis Monaco explained in a filmed interview, the commanding officer decided that he must have been the target because he was planning to send Billy home. Now, to us, that was absolutely absurd. If Billy thought he was being sent home, he would have swam home. The prosecution claimed to have an eyewitness who had seen Smith running from the scene. When this witness took the stand, he shocked the prosecutor by stating clearly, "The man I saw running was not Billy Dean Smith." Other prosecution witnesses admitted under oath that they had been intimidated by their superiors into making false statements against Smith. The case was collapsing, but the Army pressed forward. Their strongest piece of evidence, or what they claimed was their strongest evidence, was a grenade pin found in Smith's possession that supposedly matched the exploded grenade at the scene. The prosecution called a crime lab technician who testified that he had linked a grenade pin found on Private Smith with a grenade lever found near the scene of the explosion. This forensic evidence was meant to be damning, the physical proof that tied Smith to the weapon. The defense called 3 expert witnesses who systematically destroyed this testimony. One was a firearms and tool marks identification expert for the Institute of Forensic Sciences, and a former police officer. He examined the prosecution's evidence and stated bluntly, "I can take 2 pins pulled apart at random and make a better match than is represented here." The prosecution's forensic link was worthless. Moreover, soldiers in Vietnam commonly carried spare grenade pins as a safety measure in case they needed to disarm live grenades being held with their levers manually depressed. Having a grenade pin proved nothing except that Smith had been in a combat zone where grenades were standard equipment. Smith himself testified that the pin was planted on him at the time of his arrest. Given that Captain Rigby had decided Smith was guilty within minutes of the explosion and arrested him in front of the entire battalion 90 minutes later, the possibility of evidence planting wasn't speculation. It was the most logical explanation for how a grenade pin ended up in Smith's possession when he had no reason to keep such evidence if he'd actually committed the crime. Then came the moment that destroyed what remained of the prosecution's case. A soldier in Smith's battalion took the stand and testified. "I was in a bunker smoking with Billy Smith when we heard the explosion," an alibi witness, placing Smith somewhere else when the fragging occurred. The prosecution had no physical evidence that could withstand scrutiny, no credible eyewitness testimony, witnesses who recanted under oath, and now an alibi placing their suspect away from the scene. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. On November 14th, 1972, they returned with their verdict. Not guilty of murder, not guilty of attempted murder, not guilty of the assault charges. Billy Dean Smith was acquitted on all 6 serious counts. The only conviction was for resisting arrest, the most minor charge, stemming from Billy spitting at and attempting to knee the officer who arrested him 90 minutes after the explosion. Even this conviction would be overturned 3 years later when the Army Court of Military Review ruled that since Smith was innocent of the underlying charges, the arrest and apprehension was unlawful and he was entitled to resist such an arrest with reasonable force. 13 members of Smith's family cheered loudly as the verdict was read. After nearly 2 years in solitary confinement, 23 hours a day in a cell measuring 5 by 9 feet, Billy Dean Smith walked free on November 14th, 1972. The stockade released him immediately. No apology from the Army, no compensation for the time stolen from him, just freedom. Sudden and overwhelming after months of isolation. The following day, Billy held a press conference. Angela Davis attended. His statement was measured, clear-eyed, and devastating. One of the questions which has been asked of me repeatedly since my acquittal yesterday at Fort Ord concerns how I feel about the system of military justice. Most people want to know whether my acquittal means that I got a fair trial, or insist that it is proof positive that the system works. May I say that the system of military justice is still riddled with injustice. If I had been tried in Vietnam, or if I had failed to receive tremendous popular support throughout the world, or if I did not have a brilliant attorney like Luke McKissack, I would have been railroaded. Considering that I was not tried by a jury of my peers, but by 7 career combat officers, it is clear that the Army had no evidence of my guilt. I was simply singled out as a scapegoat for the 600 fraggings which have occurred in the last 4 years in Vietnam, and which reflect the low state of morale among enlisted men who want to stop the war, stop the defenseless slaughter of Vietnamese. I was chosen for trial because I was an outspoken critic of the war and was not afraid to expose the racism in Vietnam. I am glad to be free, but I can't really be free until the war in Southeast Asia is over. Billy understood what many observers missed. His acquittal didn't vindicate the system. It exposed the system's willingness to destroy an innocent man because he refused to remain silent about injustice. The fact that he was acquitted after 2 years of solitary confinement wasn't evidence that military justice worked. It was evidence that military justice had failed catastrophically, and only overwhelming public pressure and a brilliant defense attorney had prevented a complete miscarriage of justice. The Army's case against Billy Dean Smith had been, as critics called it, a blatant and groundless persecution of an innocent man. The prosecution's own witnesses provided the most convincing evidence of Smith's innocence. One prosecution witness was revealed to have been undesirably discharged from the military 3 different times under 3 different names, his credibility destroyed on the stand. The supposed eyewitness recanted. The forensic evidence was debunked by experts. The supposed motive, hatred of officers who were processing his discharge, made no logical sense. Yet the Army had held Billy in solitary confinement for 20 months, demanded his execution, and only relented when faced with a jury that couldn't ignore the absence of evidence. The identity of the actual person who threw that grenade on March 15, 1971, has never been definitively established. The investigation ended with Billy's acquittal. Whoever killed Lieutenants Delwo and Harlan got away with it, protected by the Army's rush to judgment against a convenient scapegoat. The real investigation had ended 90 minutes after the explosion, when Captain Rigby decided Billy Dean Smith was guilty because he was the only man I had problems with. Everything that followed was an attempt to justify that predetermined conclusion. Billy Dean Smith's case occurred at the intersection of multiple crises tearing at American society and its military. The Vietnam War had destroyed military morale to the point where soldiers were killing their own officers in unprecedented numbers. The civil rights movement had made black service members unwilling to accept the racism that previous generations had endured in silence. The anti-war movement had created networks of support for soldiers who resisted, transforming individual acts of defiance into a collective challenge to military authority. All these currents converged in Billy's court-martial. The fragging epidemic itself revealed the collapse of military discipline and legitimacy. Over 900 documented or suspected incidents between 1969 and 1972 meant that on average, more than 2 fragging attempts occurred every week. Officers in Vietnam began sleeping in different locations each night, never establishing predictable patterns. Some wore flak jackets inside their own camps. Colin Powell, serving as a major in Vietnam during his second tour from 1968 to 1969, recalled, "I moved my cot every night, partly to thwart Viet Cong informants who might be tracking me, but also because I did not rule out attacks on authority from within the battalion itself." The threat came not from enemy forces, but from the soldiers these officers commanded. The Army wanted to make an example of someone for fragging, to send a message that killing officers wouldn't be tolerated. Billy Dean Smith, outspoken, black, opposed to the war, was the perfect scapegoat. His conviction and execution would serve multiple purposes: punish fragging, intimidate anti-war soldiers, and reinforce military hierarchy. The problem was that Billy hadn't done it, and the Army's evidence was so weak that even a jury of career officers couldn't ignore the absence of proof. The treatment Billy received compared to William Calley exposed the military justice system's racial double standard with brutal clarity. Calley murdered Vietnamese civilians by the dozens and lived in comfort while awaiting his appeals. Billy was accused of killing white officers and lived in a cell barely large enough to lie down. The message wasn't subtle. Vietnamese lives didn't matter, but threatening white authority meant the harshest possible punishment. Both cases involved death, military discipline, and the Vietnam War's moral chaos. But only one involved a black man accused of harming the command structure, and that's why only one man spent 2 years in solitary confinement before trial. The statistics on military justice in Vietnam support what Billy experienced individually. Black troops received 34.3% of courts-martial, despite being only 16.3% of draftees. They comprised 58% of prisoners at Long Binh Jail. In 1971, less than honorable discharges were issued to 1 of every 7 black servicemen, compared to only 1 of every 14 white servicemen. The system was designed to discipline black soldiers more harshly, to view their resistance to racism as insubordination rather than legitimate grievance, to punish them for refusing to be what First Sergeant Willis's generation had called good soldiers. Billy Dean Smith was not a good soldier by the Army's definition. He questioned orders, criticized racism, opposed the war openly, and refused to pretend that black men dying in disproportionate numbers for a failed cause represented anything other than injustice. This honesty, this refusal to perform gratitude for the opportunity to serve, made him dangerous in the Army's eyes, not because he would actually frag officers, but because his example might inspire other black soldiers to speak out, to resist, to recognize that they didn't have to accept the military's racism as inevitable. The anti-war movement's support for Billy demonstrated that resistance to the Vietnam War had evolved beyond individual conscience to organized solidarity. Vietnam veterans against the war didn't just advocate for Billy's release. They held a trial of the army near Fort Ord that found the military guilty of railroading an innocent man. The United States Servicemen's Fund coordinated demonstrations at Fort Ord and in cities across America and overseas. The Black Panther Party connected Billy's case to broader struggles against institutional racism. Angela Davis, whose own recent acquittal on politically motivated charges had made her an international symbol of resistance, brought her voice and credibility to Billy's defense. This network of support wasn't charity. It was recognition that Billy's case represented something larger than one wrongful prosecution. It was the military's attempt to terrorize soldiers into silence, to use the threat of capital punishment to suppress dissent, to prove that speaking out about racism and opposing an unjust war would be treated as crimes worthy of execution. The movement's success in preventing Billy's railroading demonstrated that organized resistance could challenge even the military's power to destroy individuals who defied it. After his acquittal, Billy faded from public view. He'd spent 2 formative years, from age 23 to 25, in isolation. The psychological toll of 23 hours a day in a cell measuring 5 by 9 feet, facing potential execution for a crime you didn't commit. Watching a white officer who murdered hundreds live in comfort while you rotted in solitary confinement cannot be easily measured or overcome. Billy had survived, had won his freedom, but at what cost? Those years can't be returned. The trauma doesn't disappear because a jury delivers the correct verdict. The military never apologized to Billy Dean Smith. They never investigated who actually threw the grenade that killed Lieutenants Delwo and Harlan. They never compensated him for the 20 months stolen from his life. They never disciplined Captain Rigby or First Sergeant Willis for their rush to judgment, for calling a formation 90 minutes after the explosion, and arresting a man based on nothing more than personal animosity. The army simply moved on, as if nearly executing an innocent man was just an unfortunate mistake, rather than a deliberate attempt to sacrifice a black soldier to shore up collapsing military authority. Billy's statement after his acquittal remains the most powerful summary of what his case revealed. The system of military justice was riddled with injustice, and only massive public support and brilliant legal defense had prevented his railroading. Without Luke McKissick's skill, without the anti-war movement's pressure, without international attention focused on Fort Ord, Billy Dean Smith would have been convicted on manufactured evidence and circumstantial assumptions. He would have died for a crime he didn't commit, executed to satisfy the military's need for a scapegoat, his name added to the long list of black service members destroyed by the institution they served. The fragging epidemic ended not because the army executed Billy Dean Smith, but because the Vietnam War ended. American combat troops withdrew, the draft ended, and the military transitioned to an all-volunteer force that couldn't rely on conscription to fill its ranks with unwilling soldiers. The conditions that produced over 900 fragging incidents, the rage and despair of men forced to fight in a war they opposed under officers they despised, dissolved when those men went home and the military had to convince people to enlist rather than drafting them. But the racism Billy Dean Smith experienced, the double standards in military justice, the willingness to destroy black service members who speak out about injustice. These patterns didn't end with Vietnam. They continue in different forms, in disparities in discipline rates and promotion opportunities, in the overrepresentation of black service members in combat roles and underrepresentation in officer ranks, in the presumption that black soldiers who challenge racism are troublemakers rather than patriots, demanding that America live up to its stated ideals. Billy Dean Smith's story matters because it exposes how institutions use scapegoating to avoid confronting their own failures. The army didn't want to admit that its soldiers were killing officers because morale had collapsed, because the war was lost, because men forced to fight in an unjust cause had turned their weapons on those who sent them into meaningless danger. It was easier to blame one black soldier, to claim that fragging was the work of individual bad actors rather than a symptom of systemic failure. Billy's acquittal forced a reckoning the Army didn't want to have. His case also reveals the power of solidarity and organized resistance. Without the anti-war movement, without civil rights organizations, without public pressure and skilled legal defense, Billy would have been convicted. The military had every advantage. They controlled the evidence, chose the jury, defined the charges, and held Billy in conditions designed to break him psychologically. But they couldn't withstand scrutiny, couldn't maintain the fiction of guilt when activists and attorneys demanded actual evidence, when witnesses recanted under oath, when their forensic case collapsed under expert examination. Individual resistance is brave, but collective resistance can win. Private Billy Dean Smith was never supposed to survive his court-martial. The Army demanded his execution. They held him in solitary confinement for nearly 2 years. They built their case on manufactured evidence and intimidated witnesses. They made him a scapegoat for 900 fragging incidents and the collapse of military discipline in Vietnam. They compared him unfavorably to William Calley, suggesting that a black man accused of killing white officers deserved harsher treatment than a white officer convicted of murdering Vietnamese civilians. The system was designed to destroy him. He survived because he refused to confess to something he didn't do, because his family and community rallied to his defense, because the anti-war and civil rights movements recognized that his case represented more than one man's freedom, because a skilled attorney was willing to fight for an unpopular client, and because even a jury of career officers couldn't ignore the complete absence of credible evidence. In the end, the truth mattered. Not enough to prevent 20 months of solitary confinement, not enough to trigger an apology or compensation, but enough to prevent an execution. On November 15, 1972, the day after his acquittal, Billy Dean Smith told the world that he was glad to be free. But he couldn't really be free until the war in Southeast Asia was over, until the system that had tried to execute him was forced to change. The war ended 3 years later. Whether the system changed remains an open question, answered differently depending on who you ask. But Billy's story endures as a reminder of what happens when institutions prioritize hierarchy over justice. When black men who speak truth to power are treated as threats rather than patriots, and when the military's need for scapegoats outweighs its commitment to finding actual perpetrators. First Lieutenant Thomas Delwo died the day before he was scheduled to leave Vietnam, killed by a fragmentation grenade thrown by someone who was never identified. First Lieutenant Richard Harlan died in his sleep, never knowing what hit him. They deserved justice, a real investigation, an actual attempt to find who killed them. Instead, their deaths were used to justify the attempted destruction of an innocent man because he was convenient, because he was black, because he'd spoken out, because 90 minutes was apparently enough time to decide guilt without evidence. Billy Dean Smith was the first person tried in the United States for a fragging committed in Vietnam. His acquittal ensured he wouldn't be the last person executed for speaking truth about racism and an unjust war.